Alrighty, everybody, here we are on our last lecture. I know you're all sad. So we're going to finish up with muscle metabolism here. So let's jump into here and we'll look at a couple of different types of muscle metabolism. What I wanted to show you in here is basically the different pathways that we can generate ATP. And so what we'll see here, and so obviously in this yellow box is our muscle fiber, and over here is our blood capillaries. You can see glucose is coming out, oxygen is coming out, fatty acids are coming in, and we're going to be getting rid of our wastes from all these processes. Carbon dioxide would also be in there. So if we're using creatine phosphate, we can generate ATP. Through glycolysis, we're going to generate ATP, and so you should be pretty familiar with glycolysis. And then we can also we also have oxidative phosphorylation that's going to help ATP. So we're going to look at these in a little bit more detail. If we kind of think about that and we look at our short duration exercises, what we can see is that, really quickly, the ATP that is stored in our muscles is used up fast, right? Within about 6 seconds or so. And then within the next 4 or so seconds, we use up our ATP that's formed from that creatine phosphate and ADP. Once we get into a little bit longer, so 30 to 40 seconds, we are taking our glycogen that's stored in our muscles, we're breaking it down into glucose, and we are going to generate ATP from that. And then by the time this kind of runs through until our short duration exercise is over. And so along this way, we're going to see this sort of creatine phosphate pathway, this glycolysis pathway, and this glycogenolysis pathway where we're breaking down glycogen. Now, if we look at a longer duration exercise, where we're talking about hours of exercise, ATP is generated from different pathways, okay? And so that was that oxidative phosphorylation pathway that we were talking about. And so it's using oxygen that's coming out of that myoglobin or coming from hemoglobin in our red blood cell. All right, now if we look at this direct phosphorylation, so basically this is this reaction between creatine phosphate, which you can see here in pink, and ADP. And so what is our source here is our creatine phosphate. And from that reaction, we can generate 1 ATP per creatine phosphate. As a result, we get creatine, that's sort of our product out of this. But we aren't using any oxygen. And so it's sort of a low return on investment if you think about it that way, right? We're getting 1 ATP per 1 creatine phosphate. And so that's going to give us a little bit of energy to kind of last us about 15 seconds or so. If we look at our anaerobic pathways, so when we talk about glycolysis and lactic acid formation, basically here our energy source is glucose. So we have glucose that's coming from breaking down glycogen, or it's maybe in our blood sugar as well. And so as we break down that glucose, we're going to get 2 ATP. So out of this pathway, we get 2 ATP per glucose, but we also get lactic acid, and so that is going to be released into the blood. But again, it doesn't require oxygen, and so it gives us a little bit more energy than our previous pathway. So going to give us about 60 seconds or a little bit more of really good energy. Now the best pathway here is that aerobic pathway, and so this is what you've probably spent a lot of biology classes studying, our aerobic cellular respiration. So our energy source can be glucose, but it can also be pyruvic acid, fatty acids, non-carbohydrate sources, okay? And so all of these can help generate ATP. But in this pathway, we do require oxygen, and that's going to help give us a much higher return on our investment. So 32 ATP per glucose. And this is what's going to be providing long-term energy, like hours of energy here. Now, after really long-term exercise, even after some short-term sprinting, we can go into what's called oxygen debt, and this is where we need to replace that oxygen from hemoglobin or the myoglobin. So you can see this person kind of bent over, they're hunched over, they're trying to respire and get more oxygen in to replace what was used up because of those that aerobic pathway. And so we need to meet the oxygen demands of our tissue, but also to help metabolize lactic acid. Now, when we talk about muscle fatigue, this is obviously the weakness and our loss of contractility. So if you were to take a rubber ball and kind of squeeze this over and over and over again, maybe you do this while you're driving, but at some point you start losing the ability to do that, and the strength of squeezing decreases the longer you're doing it. Or if you were to take your textbook or your computer, you're sitting there in front of your laptop right now or your desktop, and you were to hold that up and hold it there, at some point those muscles are going to fatigue. So why does that happen? Well, you can think of it probably along the lines of ATP concentration. So the longer we're doing something, that ATP is going to decline as that glycogen is broken down. As we decrease our ATP stores, remember our sodium-potassium pump rely on ATP to actively transport sodium out and potassium in, up their concentration gradients. So that reduces the the functionality of those sodium-potassium pumps, and that therefore can compromise our resting membrane potential. And so if we're decreasing that ability to maintain that resting membrane potential, then that may change our excitability of those muscle cells. We can change the pH of that sarcoplasm, and if we release potassium with those action potentials, it can actually cause the accumulation of extracellular potassium. So if this sodium-potassium pump isn't working and we're not pumping that potassium back in, that can then hyperpolarize our cell and make those fibers a little bit less excitable. Along the lines of our motor nerve fibers, if you during fatigue, they can actually use up their neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and so if they're not producing as much acetylcholine, there's not going to be as many molecules binding to those nicotinic receptors, and so there's going to be a less likelihood of stimulating those muscle fibers. And then last, our central nervous system actually fatigues, and so it can reduce its signals that it's sending back out to those skeletal muscles, and that can then also cause fatigue. So our endurance then is the ability for us to maintain these really high intensity exercises for a prolonged period of time. So at least 4 to 5 minutes. And for a lot of people that can be pretty challenging. And so this can be determined by your maximum oxygen uptake. So you'll hear it as VO2 max, your maximum volume of oxygen. So what is that? That is the point when the rate of our oxygen consumption is sort of plateauing out, and you can't increase it anymore. So you're at your maximum amount of oxygen you can take in, and so it is proportional to your body size. It does peak around age 20. So for you all that are out there that are in your 20 age bracket there, you're starting to decline in your VO2 max. It is generally greater in males than females, but that doesn't mean you can't change it, right? So really well-trained athletes can change their VO2 max. So again, we can modify our neurons and our synapses in our brains. We can also modify our muscles. We can modify our VO2 max. Our bodies are really adaptable. Now, how can we beat muscle fatigue? So probably there's a handful of you out there that are, taking oral creatine supplements, going into the gym, working out, and so again, that does increase the speed of that ATP regeneration. So, but again, if you think back to that first pathway, for 1 molecule of creatine phosphate, we're getting 1 molecule of ATP. And so really this is good for weightlifting, right? Really quick, short types of exercises. You should obviously look into it rather than just taking it and knowing a little bit more about it, because there are some risks that can be associated with oral creatine. And again, you've got to be thinking about, well, how much are you taking? Are you just urinating a lot of that out and making really expensive urine? Are you seeing any types of electrolyte balances, dehydration, etc.? Okay, so do your homework before you just start going to GNC and dropping your money. I don't even know if GNC still exists. And then carbohydrate loading. And so a lot of people will do this a day or two before some really big competitions. And so the idea is that we're packing glycogen into those muscle cells, okay? And so as we pack in that glycogen, that's going to add extra sources of energy to go through a glycogenolysis, break that into glucose, and then produce ATP from that. Okay, so then we want to talk a little bit about our different muscle fiber types. So that's sort of our last section here. So we can classify these fibers, one by the velocity of their shortening, okay, and the pathways that they use to form ATP. So you can see here we have 4 different branches. So in this first group, we have fast fibers. And so those fast fibers, if you remember back to our other lecture, when we have cross bridges, the myosin heads bind to those active sites on our actin subunits, we form those cross bridges. And so with fast fibers, we see that those cross bridges are hydrolyzed really quickly, or hydrolyze the ATP really quickly. So we break those fibers down much quicker so we can shorten those Z discs, or the sarcomeres, much more rapidly. Whereas our slow fibers tend to hydrolyze ATP a little bit more slowly. Now, if we talk about their pathways using to form ATP, we can have our oxidative fibers, and so they have a much higher capacity for oxidative phosphorylation, and if you remember, that's going to be our highest return of ATP. And then we have our glycolytic fibers, and so they have a high capacity for glycolysis. So again, shorter return on our ATP amounts. So now we can kind of combine all of those 4 groups to make 3 different types of fibers. And so we can classify them again based off of that speed and their ATP production. So type 1 fibers, as you can see here, are slower. So they're slower to break those cross bridges, and they're slow twitch. So if you remember back when we were talking about the different graphs last lecture, they're going to have slower twitches to them. They are oxidative, so they're going to be producing a lot more ATP. And so these fibers tend to be red in color, and they are resistant to fatigue, or very resistant, not permanently resistant to fatigue, but not as much tension is developed. So they're a little bit, they're less strong, if you will. And these tend to have smaller motor units to them, okay? Type 2B are our fast glycolytic fibers. So they are fast twitch. They're going to break down those cross bridges much faster, and they are going to be running energy through their glycolytic pathway, or through glycolysis. So they're going to be producing less ATP. These tend to be white in color, and they create the greatest amount of tension, but they are fatiguing very rapidly, okay, because they're going through that anaerobic pathway. Now, type 2A is sort of a combination of these two. So we see very fast twitch, but they're using that oxidative phosphorylation pathway. And so we see that they are sort of white and red. And so they develop more tension than type 1, and they're aerobic, but they aren't as fatigue resistant as type 1. So they're sort of in between these two types of fibers. And these tend to have larger motor units. Now here's a cross-section kind of showing you these fast glycolytic fibers and the slow oxidative fibers. Now, you'll notice these slow oxidative fibers are much more red in color, and so these tend to have an abundant amount of mitochondria, myoglobin, and capillaries, right? So they get this deeper red in color. They're adapted for aerobic respiration and that fatigue resistance, right? They have their relatively long twitches are lasting about 100 milliseconds. So if you think back to our previous lecture, and so you can kind of think about these being in places like our postural muscles of our back or in our soleus, okay, that's going to help us stand up for long periods of time. Now those fast glycolytic fibers are fast twitch. They are adapted for fast responses, but not so much fatigue resistant like these slow oxidative fibers. They are lower or poor in mitochondria, myoglobin, and capillaries, right? And so that gives them sort of that pale appearance. But the sarcoplasmic reticulum releases and reabsorbs calcium much more quickly, and so that is going to allow for those contractions to be much quicker. Okay, so we find these fast glycolytic fibers in the muscles of our eyes, those fast twitch muscles, the extrinsic muscles of our eyes to kind of move our eyes really quickly, in our gastrocnemius or our biceps brachii, right? So our soleus is generally used for posture, where those the gastrocnemius is, for jumping or really quick movements. So if you look at sort of a dispersal of, the range of people, and if you were to look at a world-class sprinter, you would probably see much more slow type 1 fibers and a lot more of a concentration of these fast type fibers over here. And so on this left side, we can see a percent of our total muscle. So these fast type fibers are going to be in much higher concentration. If you look at a world marathon runner or an extreme endurance athlete, if there's any of you all out there that are running these 50, 100-mile races, generally you're going to have these slow type fibers in high concentration and much less of that fast type fibers. So again, here's just a couple of examples. Usain Bolt, probably much higher in these fast type fibers versus Mo Farah, who's this long distance runner and is going to probably have much higher concentration of these slow twitch fibers. So how does that apply to you all? Well, when we talk about strength and conditioning, and you actually look at the muscles themselves, they actually can generate a lot of tension, and so oftentimes more than the bones and tendons can withstand. So our bodies are, kind of regulating that. But that muscular strength depends on, and this is somewhat of a review from things that we've talked about, our muscle size, okay? The fascicle arrangement. So if you remember back to those muscle architectures, so pennate versus our fusiform, right, versus our circular muscles. So the way that those fascicles are arranged is going to affect our muscle strength. The size of those motor units that are going to come in, where those motor neurons are coming into maybe 3 muscle fibers versus 1,000 muscle fibers, is going to generate a stronger contraction. If we have summation, right, or more motor unit recruitment, so when stronger contractions are needed, our nervous system stimulates more muscle units, right? So when last lecture, when we were talking about picking up a pen versus picking up a boulder, you know that you don't need to have as many motor units firing to pick up a pen as you do to pick up that big boulder. And then summation over time. So as our nerve impulses are coming in, remember we talked about different frequencies, and if we have a high frequency, 40 to 50 stimuli per second, we get into that complete tetanus state. And so the higher the frequency of those stimulation, the more strongly that muscle is going to contract. And then we mentioned length-tension relationship. So depending on where our sarcomeres are, if they're in that optimal 80 to 120% range, they're going to contract more forcefully than if it's contracted or overstretched. And last is, generally dependent on the fatigue. So if a muscle is already fatigued, then it's going to contract more weakly than a muscle that's well rested or even warmed up. So, when you're thinking about this moving forward in your training, and obviously those athletes out there, when you're working with your trainers and your coaches, you've probably heard a lot of this. Those of you that are really into weightlifting, you probably know a lot of this already. But as you're working out and you're incorporating some resistance training, right, we are contracting those muscles against some kind of load that's resisting that movement. So when we think about weightlifting, you're picking up lots of weights, you are then kind of contracting them against that load. So doing that a few times a week for 20 minutes or so is pretty good. That can actually help stimulate some muscle growth. Obviously, you're not going to be in any Mr. America competition or person of the universe competition. And then endurance training is really focusing on this aerobic exercise, so long-term exercise. So you're trying to improve those fatigue-resistant muscles. Those slow twitch fibers are going to produce more mitochondria, more glycogen, and they're going to develop a larger density of blood capillaries so that they can bring more glucose and oxygen into those fibers. That's going to increase your skeletal strength. And again, it's going to increase your red blood cell count and therefore your oxygen delivery. So this is really good all around. And all the way around, it's increasing your cardiovascular system, respiratory and nervous systems, right? You're going to be delivering more oxygen and glucose into your brain, and your brain's going to be working out and being able to function at a higher level as well. So that brings us to the end of our muscle unit. I hope this is very applicable to you. I hope you can sort of look at this now from more of a A&P perspective, and next time you're sitting on the couch being like, I'm just kind of tired, I don't think I need to do this. And try to get up, get some exercise. It's going to really improve all of those 11 systems that we studied way back when at Unit 1. So thanks for tuning in. Have a wonderful rest of your semester. Best of luck with finals, and hope to see you around in 202.